to ask the Scottish Government when it expects to conclude negotiations with Peel Ports regarding the purchase of Adrossan Harbour.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
As I confirmed to the Adrossan Task Force in Arran last week, CMAL are leading on commercial discussions with Peel Ports Group, and these discussions are currently ongoing. These are commercial and confidential discussions, and I cannot comment on the detail at this point. There is a requirement to agree heads of terms between Peel Ports Group and CMAL before any change of ownership could be confirmed, following a fair and negotiated settlement and due diligence undertaken by CMAL on behalf of Scottish ministers. The potential transaction could be finalised by summer 2025, dependent on progress in these discussions.
Kenny Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. It's now almost 10 years since the redevelopment of Adrossan Harbour was proposed, with no discernible progress. Eventually, 9 weeks ago, the Cabinet Secretary announced the Scottish Government would explore options to buy the harbour from private owner Peel Ports. Since then, much to the frustration of my constituents, there has been little word from Scottish ministers on when such discussions will conclude, and again we have heard no firm date, or even who is undertaking them on the Government's behalf. So in the interest of transparency, can the Cabinet Secretary say who is leading negotiations for the Scottish Government and how often they have met with Peel Ports since the 18th of February?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I indicated in my original answer, CMAL are leading on commercial discussions with Peel Ports Group. I had the opportunity to talk to the Isle of Arran Ferry Committee and gave them that update last week. I also was in Adrossan, where I also met with campaigners who have been heavily involved, and part of my discussions with them was relaying them the importance of securing that purchase. On the purchase of that harbour, we can provide the investments and, importantly, the level of investment, which I'm sure the member readily understands. I also was able to reiterate to him, to reiterate to both groups, that the Scottish Government is committed to Adrossan, and that in our interim support for Adrossan, I've made it quite clear that on behalf of the representations of the member, Kenny Gibson, the constituency MSP themselves and the Isle of Arran Ferry Group, that the return of the Caledonian Isles will see operating out of Adrossan. There will be a two-port solution to make sure that as long as is possible the Adrossan Harbour is used.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that further reply. Many Arran and Adrossan constituents are understandably upset and angry at the Scottish Government's apparent lack of urgency in concluding the discussions with regard to the harbour's redevelopment and taking it forward. Central Adrossan is one of Scotland's 5 poorest communities, where 44% of households survive on benefits. 165 jobs directly depend on the harbour, and they're in limbo, while vulnerable elderly Arran residents have been transferred to the mainland as care workers struggle to travel to and from Adrossan. The outlined business plans for harbour redevelopment have been imminent, it seems, for years. When will they finally and definitively be published? And when does the Cabinet Secretary envisage a contract for the redevelopment of Adrossan Harbour going out to tender?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, quite clearly, a tender would be far preferable should the harbour come under the ownership of the Scottish Government, and the works that CMAL are preparing, both in the short, medium and long term, can then be developed and indeed published. And I recognise the desire from the local community to understand when works on Adrossan Harbour will begin and what those works will be and how they will be scheduled. But such a timeline can only be reasonably established and published on the actual purchase and transfer of control of the port. I do not want to take part in anything that would compromise our commercial and confidential negotiations. It really is important that the Scottish Government and the funders from our taxpayer base will understand it's important that we get the best value from that. If you want to speed a negotiation and compromise a negotiation and compromise the value for the public purse, then I think there's a risk in me going into the type of commitments that, quite understandably, Kenny Gibson wants me to make in the here and now. But he makes a very central point, and that's about the regeneration that is going to be required around Adrossan, regardless of what happens and when with the harbour. The harbour is central to that, I understand that. But part of my discussions also with the Save the Adrossan Harbour campaign and also with the Isle of Arran Ferry Committee and indeed also with the task force was the importance that once we've had the short, medium and long-term plans set out for the harbour, that alongside that we need to see the regeneration of that vitally important area that I understand that Mr Gibson is so passionate about.
Sue Webber.
Thank you. Time is of the essence, Cabinet Secretary. Residents of Adrossan have been messed about by the SNP ever since this ferry fiasco started a decade ago, with one resident saying why anyone would commission a ferry that doesn't fit Adrossan Harbour for the route it is meant for is crazy. And given the limitations outlined in your previous answers, Cabinet Secretary, can you guarantee the negotiations will actually deliver for Arran and Adrossan residents? And how much money has the Cabinet Secretary allocated to upgrade Adrossan Harbour in the event of a successful purchase?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would point out that the Conservatives refused to support the budget which contained funding for Adrossan Harbour.
Thank you, members.
I would also point out, if she doesn't understand, and perhaps she might want to look into that history, regrettably a long history, of what's happened at that harbour, it is owned by a private company. The original plans for Adrossan Harbour were to be developed by the private company Peel Ports and Ayrshire Council. And North Ayrshire Council. So in terms of what do I see as the best option I see it to get the level of investment that I think is required. I'm sure she also understands the UK subsidy control measures, which again her government brought in. If she understood that, if she understands the basis of business commercial negotiations, she would understand that there has to be space and time for successful negotiations to take place, and her line of questioning does not help that.
Jamie Green.
Thank you. Just before recess, I met with campaigners from Adrossan in my office in Largs, and they made it clear that whilst any move to end this impasse over Adrossan Harbour is welcome, what is happening at the moment is that businesses in Adrossan on the High Street are going bust. They're losing footfall, they're losing traffic and they're losing money. So in that vein, will the Cabinet Secretary speak with Cabinet colleagues and look to establish a small business fund that would help those small local businesses in Adrossan tide them over for the meantime, because they simply cannot wait for that footfall to return whilst that port is being redeveloped?
Cabinet Secretary.
I understand the member's request. I think it's something that should be considered at the appropriate time. He may have heard me say that I was committed, because of the intervention by Kenneth Gibson and also the Isle of Arran Ferry Committee itself, to ensure that Adrossan operates as long as is possible, and obviously the Caledonian Isles sailing from Adrossan when it returns will help in that short term. But you will also be aware, and I think this is a really important point in the regeneration, the works that will be required at Adrossan Harbour will cause disruption, and I think he's quite right to identify that that will need active discussion and ongoing discussion with local businesses as to what happens in that period.